mean, the one thing was kind of groundbreaking about this piece is that there's 2 bars of an orchestral introduction before the soloist comes in. Everything up until now, I mean, you look at any Mozart concerto, like you have to wait for 2 minutes before you hear the solo violin come in. Tchaikovsky concerto, Brahms concerto, it's kind of all the same. But with Mendelssohn, he was like, nah,
get right to it.
Scratch that. Let's just have the violin introduce all the main material. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, it was a sort of, you know, ahead of its time in some ways, but he's found different ways to color all of the different melodies and themes that happen in the piece, and he definitely got a little adventurous with some of the violin technique.
And are those techniques easier to execute in E minor because of the open strings or because of a certain way the violin is?
That's a great question. I mean, I never really thought about it that way. E minor is not a key that is super common for violin concertos, I guess. I think there's something expressively about the key of E minor that Mendelssohn was going for. You know, this was written sort of near the end of his life. He died pretty young. The most common sort of character that you can find across Mendelssohn's work throughout his life is this sense of not anxiety, but there's an angst about it. There's something that's very much kind of bittersweet and sometimes more on the bitter side of bittersweet that he was trying to express. And I think E minor is a really interesting key for that.
So what is the main theme of the first movement? Can you kind of...
Yeah, I can play it. He repeats that theme again and sort of naturally gives way to a little bit more sort of pizzazz in the violin part right away. So he doesn't waste any time getting into the nitty-gritty of, like I said, the thematic material and also the sort of technical prowess that's necessary for the violinist.
So let's talk about some of those double stops or some of those chords that he's able to put into expanding. Because he has so much fun with this E minor. Like, it all stays around E minor, but the violin is responsible for kind of taking the harmony to new places instead of like the orchestra.
I mean, there's a lot of examples of concerti where most of the thematic material is presented, obviously, initially by the orchestra.
Right.
The violin might eventually take it, but in the development of some of that material, the violin sort of embellishes, you know, the main melodic material that's going on in the orchestra. So, I mean, there's a great example of that in the Mendelssohn coming out of the cadenza, where the orchestra takes back the themes after this sort of... I wouldn't call it an interruption, but a cadenza, you know, more traditionally comes sort of near the end of the movement, and after the violin, you know, does its thing with all the sort of virtuosic techniques, harmonics, and everything. Then there's a really cool sort of embellishment that the violin does harmonically while the orchestra plays all the melodic material. Maybe I'll demonstrate that.
Yeah.
So it's a technique that's called ricochet, which I think once I play it and show you, you'll understand why. It really requires you to sort of just allow it to happen. If I were to try and demonstrate ricochet slowly, I'm really controlling every bounce, right, with my right hand so that the tempo stays consistent. Once you get to a point where it's in tempo, like it is in the piece, you almost can't really try to micromanage it like that. Any sort of tension and over, you know, kind of micromanagement of the stroke actually just kind of makes it fall apart. So I'll show you first if I were to try to do it, trying to really control it, and then I'll do it as I will try to do it in the concert. I'm really gripping the bow here. So you get a little bit of bounce, but the bow doesn't really want to leave the string. So when I relax a little bit and kind of after that initial drop, the ricochet sort of just happens. You're just kind of guiding the bow. At the end of the day, when it comes time to put it into action in context, it sort of just has to flow, you know? And it's an interesting technique because it's different with every bow. Different bows have different sort of points of equilibrium, different bounce points.
Okay.
So if I were to try to do that technique down here, it would not work because this part of the bow is just too heavy. If I were to do it too high, it's too light. So I wouldn't actually have the ability, there's not enough weight in this part of the bow to create that sort of bouncing effect. So for me, for this bow in particular, it's kind of somewhere just above middle. And yeah, it just requires a great deal of trust in your equipment and in your training and in your practice. In the second movement, the second theme area of the second movement, which the orchestra actually does introduce that theme briefly before the violin comes in. But I always thought it was interesting that Mendelssohn sort of took two different voices from the orchestra and put them both into the solo violin part. So the theme itself happens in the upper strings, and some of the winds as well have that melody for the first time. And there's this sort of noodly ostinato figure that comes in the inner strings. And so when the violin comes in, I have the honor of playing both of those pieces of material. So I have. I always just thought that part was so cool. Yeah, it's something that if you're hearing it for the first time, you might not even realize that the violin has both of those parts.
So who in the orchestra is handling those parts? Like, is it goes to the oboe
actually,
or the
second
flute or
violins
something?
have the sort of this oscillating 16th notes.
Got it. So you're
yeah.
with the section.
Well, it's interesting because the theme is broken up into a few different sort of parts. So after this. And then it goes back and forth between this sort of oscillating melody. But when I'm not playing that theme, the second violins or the violas might have the sort of oscillations. But when I come in, I sort of take it back from them. They pass it to me, and then I've got to take care of that and also the melodic line. So I thought it was really cool. It was a place that used to give me nightmares because it's a really tough thing.
It's subtle, though.
Yeah, as far as coordination goes, I mean, it's not one of those things that sounds or looks really difficult when you watch someone play it. But the subtlety of making sure that both lines obviously come out clearly and are audible, but that they're shaped as well. And it's not just this flat sort of monotone melody in favor of making sure that it's clean. So that it gets a little bit, I mean, I'll show you later on. So as it develops harmonically, it sort of intensifies, obviously. And it's, you could play it completely straight and just make sure everything is kind of in place. Or you can really try and sort of inspire that kind of development and that kind of evolution of sound within the orchestra as well.